Welcome, everybody. It's good to see so many familiar faces here tonight. Welcome to this University of Buckingham Center for Heterodox Social Science event, Is Woke Dead? We have a fantastic array of speakers tonight. We've got Matt Goodwin, Saad and Batya Ungar-Sargon, who are going to be coming down onto the stage in a minute. So woke is, as I define it, the making sacred of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual identity groups. The question before us tonight is whether this ideology, which has convulsed the West in the last decade, is in fact dead, or whether it is in fact simply respawning. Woke has a whole number of downstream effects, whether we talk about border security, crime, education. It's not just about the battle of ideas on campus. A number of commentators have been arguing that, in fact, woke is dead. Most recently, Ricky Gervais, as he was getting a star in Hollywood. But also the term vibe shift has been coined by a number of people like Matthew Yglesias. Yglesias always seems to come up with the defining terms of the woke era. He came up with a great awakening, I believe. Anyway, Andrew Doyle is also of this opinion, to some degree. And it is true, we are seeing, AOC and Pete Buttigieg removing pronouns, even Ash Sarkar in this country claiming that she's against woke. So maybe there is some progress there, but on the other hand, there's a strong case as well that in fact this thing is persisting. Young people are more woke than old, and as they become the median voter, won't that bring woke back? We see concerts where artists are saying, fuck J.K. Rowling, and everyone's cheering. So maybe this thing isn't completely dead. Anyhow, our panelists are distinguished high-impact contributors to the emerging study of woke ideology. Our first guest on stage will be Professor Matt Goodwin, who is a political scientist and author, an honorary professor of politics at the University of Buckingham, and a fellow of the Center. He's the author of National Populism, the book Values, Voice, and Virtue, and most recently, Bad Education, Why Our Universities Are Broken and How to Fix Them. Goodwin is a regular media contributor and currently hosts State of the Nation on GB News. If you haven't signed up to his Substack, you've really got to do that. This is... It is, I think it's like the #1 or #2 political Substack in Britain. Yeah. Unfortunately, Matt is, because he's so in demand, he's going to have to depart a bit early to host his show, State of the Nation on GB News, not too far away. I'll now ask Saad to come down, who is, you've all heard of Saad, no doubt, the Godfather, professor of marketing at Concordia University in Canada, and a visiting professor and global ambassador at Northwood University in Michigan. He's an evolutionary psychologist and author of, amongst others, The Parasitic Mind. And I'm very much looking forward to this one, the new book on suicidal empathy, and is host of the popular YouTube channel, The Saad Truth, spelt with 2 A's, of course. Finally, we have Batya Ungar-Sargon, again, a household name, formerly deputy editor of Newsweek magazine, a regular commentator in the US media, apparently is now allowed on CNN, I'm told. A self-described, quote-unquote, MAGA leftist, known for her critiques of elite liberalism and advocacy for working-class Americans. The author of a number of important books, including Bad News, How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy, and Second Class, How the Elites Betrayed America's Working Men and Women. I'm going to start with Matt. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Eric. Well, thank you very much to Eric for organizing this event. Thank you to the University of Buckingham as well, to the Center for Heterodox Social Science, to all of you for coming along, and to my fellow speakers, whose work has been very influential, actually, for me, whether looking at the problems with the media class, which has basically become an epicenter of wokeness, through to Gad's excellent work on suicidal empathy, which is, I think, at the heart of what we're talking about this evening. Is woke dead? The first thing to figure out is, what do we mean by the word woke? And I've been very inspired by Eric's work in White Shift and Taboo, the Third Awakening, in defining this ideology as really being about the sacralization of racial, sexual, and gender minorities. The view that all minority groups are virtuous, are sacred, cannot be criticized, cannot be challenged, while the majority group is to be considered suspicious, threatening, and inherently problematic. And I think if you look at what's going on in the West today, the woke movement, which peaked, I think, in America in the 2010s, is firmly in retreat in the United States of America. And I'll defer to Batya and Gad to talk a little bit about that, because they're the real experts on North America. But I don't think woke is dead, or even close to being dead, here in the UK. Quite the contrary. Unlike America, I think we still have a new elite in this country, a political, media, creative, and cultural elite who are still overwhelmingly focused on making minority groups sacred and view especially the white British majority with suspicion and as being inherently dangerous. This is why, of course, as we've seen most recently in this country, much of that elite class that spans political parties on both the established left and the right, we haven't gone through the Trump realignment here in this country, although we're seeing something similar to the Trump realignment that I'll come back and talk about. We have not seen any correction in the elite class in this country at all. The rape gang scandal, or the grooming gang scandal, is perhaps the best symbol of this in the UK, which turned the underlying political logic of woke ideology on its head. Because here was a scandal where hundreds of thousands, if not more than 1 million, of young, white, working class girls were being sexually assaulted and raped across upwards of 50 towns and cities in this country by Pakistani Muslim gangs, despite the fact that even today, much of the legacy media class still refuse to accept that fact. But the rape gang scandal has become a very powerful symbol, in my mind, of how woke ideology remains very firmly entrenched in this country. In fact, if you look at an organization like the BBC, which I would argue has become and is still an epicenter of wokeness, up until the last couple of months, the only serious documentary on that scandal was one that portrayed a white working class girl lying about being groomed and sexually assaulted by Muslim rape gangs. It wasn't until the likes of Channel 4, remarkably, an alternative media organization, began to do proper documentaries on this scandal, although interestingly, Keir Starmer, our Labour Prime Minister, has not demanded that that documentary be shown in every school up and down this country, unlike Adolescence, which might seem a trite comparison, but that's exactly how the woke view society. Because in the fictional drama Adolescence, you have a white working class boy from a good home with 2 parents being seen as inherently problematic and threatening. Whereas anybody who's looked at the empirical reality of what's happening in this country knows that that reality indeed looks quite different. I don't think woke is dead, because much of the expert class in this country continue to openly ignore both the Cass Review, which underlined the lack of scientific evidence behind gender ideology and gender medicine, and the UK Supreme Court ruling, which recently concluded that the definition of a woman, the legal definition of a woman, is one based on biological sex. Tonight on our show, again, we're pointing to another institution, this time mental health hospitals across this country, who are responsible for violent criminals, for treating violent criminals. They are still using policies which allow biologically male patients to self-identify as women, Last week, we showed 3 NHS trusts were openly ignoring the UK Supreme Court judgment in terms of how to define a woman. The universities continue to promote gender policies and gender ideology, and the British Medical Association, supposedly a bastion of experts, recently lodged an official complaint with the Supreme Court because of its judgment. These are not serious people. These are ideologues masquerading as neutral, impartial experts. I don't think woke is dead in this country as well, because the universities, where I worked for 20 years, are still fighting tooth and nail to oppose the Free Speech Higher Education Act, a piece of legislation that actually Eric and I helped to design and deliver, which creates a mechanism whereby universities can be fined if they violate free speech, which culminated in the University of Sussex recently being fined £600,000 for violating Kathleen Stock's free speech. But despite that, Russell Group universities, vice-chancellors up and down this country maintain there is no problem with free speech on campus, when in reality, anybody who has worked in the universities knows that they are hardwired by wokeism from top to bottom. You cannot apply for an academic job in this country or a major research grant in this country if you do not submit a diversity statement with that application, if you do not pledge your allegiance to diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is a political litmus test that is used to weed out conservative and gender-critical scholars from our higher education institutions. Only today in the newspapers, Research England, the main body that oversees research grants in universities in this country, has announced a brand new action plan committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I suspect we will hear a lot about what Donald Trump is doing by taking on Harvard, by rooting out DEI. I wish some of that were happening in the UK. But from where I'm sat, the woke agenda within the universities is still strongly entrenched and has a very iron-like grip around the universities. We also still, in this country, have a political media and creative class that is wholly committed to what Michael Schellenberger and others have called the censorship industrial complex. Again, this is a crucial difference from the US. We do not have a long legacy of defending free speech in the way that Americans do. We have a Labour government which is expanding non-crime hate incidents in this country, which, if you don't know what a non-crime hate incident is, I'm pretty sure I've had a few logged against me in recent weeks. A non-crime hate incident is if you perceive one of your protected characteristics, your gender, your race, or sex, to have been offended during the course of this talk, you can call up a police station and give no evidence for your claim, but you can have a non-crime hate incident logged against me, and if I go for a job at a public sector institution, they can ask for my criminal record and see that I've had a non-crime hate incident logged against me. You might say, Matt, you are exaggerating this. 250,000 people in this country have a non-crime hate incident logged against them. We have a political class that is using things like that, as we've seen with the Lucy Connolly case. Brits will know what that is. There is a British woman in prison today based on what she tweeted. For nearly 3 years, Lucy Connolly has been sent to prison, while at the same time, members of the rape gangs actually received shorter prison sentences than Lucy Connolly. We have a Labour government that is now working, as we meet here this week, to expand the definition of Islamophobia, which is going to be used to restrict our national debate about the role and compatibility of Islam within British society. That definition of Islamophobia, agreed by Labour MPs in 2018, specifically mentions the grooming gangs, discussing the grooming gangs as an example of Islamophobia. And it specifically mentions talking about the demographic threat faced to Western nations by the rise of Islam as Islamophobia. So the piece that you might have seen in the Telegraph today, a research report that I released this morning, which is on Eric's website at the Center for Heterodox Social Science, where we show that on current projections, 1 in every 5 people in the UK will be Muslim by the end of this century, closer to 1 in 3 among the under 40s. This is one of the biggest pieces of work that's been done on the UK population. That could be considered Islamophobic because we are talking about demographic shifts that relate to Islam. This is the insanity that we are now seeing. In fact, if you look at that report, the woke ideology dominance over Westminster, I would argue, is also reflected in the continuing refusal of our political elites to do anything other than remain firmly committed to the policy of mass uncontrolled immigration and a refusal to do what is required to fix our national borders. White Britons in this country will be a minority by the year 2063. The foreign-born and their children will be a majority in this country by 2079. And as I've mentioned, by the end of this century, close to 1 in 3 of the under 40s will be following Islam. Those things are not an accident. They are the downstream effects of a specific state policy of mass uncontrolled immigration, which reflects how the institutions in this country, including the Conservative Party and including the Labour Party, have been completely hijacked by an extreme version of social liberalism, if not radical woke progressivism. In all of the institutions, you can see other symbols of this. Last week, we revealed on GB News, police are spending £10 million a year on DEI jobs. That's enough for 354 police officers. Last week, we revealed that the civil service have spent £30 million a year on diversity jobs. That's enough for 135,000 payments for pensioners to cover their winter fuel. I could go on. I just do not see any serious evidence at all that woke ideology is in retreat here in the UK. Even when we get those big judgments like the UK Supreme Court, the institutions are openly ignoring those judgments. There is, however, cause for optimism. In the political landscape, I think we are where America was around 2014, 2015. The rise of the Reform Party is now forcing a realignment of our political system, and it is forcing a correction within conservatism. Until now, the British Tory Party, the Conservatives, have remained firmly wedded to a model of conservatism that has enabled woke ideology within the institutions. It was the Conservatives, after Tony Blair, who mainstreamed the Equality Act, the public sector duties, gender ideology, did nothing about what was going on with our schools, our universities, and spent 14 years enabling the entrenchment of this ideology in our institutions. The Tories have really always been much more interested in accruing social status for themselves and not venturing into what they call the culture wars than actually doing what is required to save this country. If we want woke to be dead in this country, like I think it will end up suffering a succession of defeats in America, I think we need to do several things, and here's where I'll culminate and hand over to the real experts from America who can perhaps give us some more reasons for optimism. I think we need a factory reset in this country. That's what we need in the UK. We need to essentially return to the legislative landscape that we had prior to 1997. We need to radically reform, if not repeal, the Equality Act. We need to radically reform, if not repeal, the Human Rights Act. We need to fully leave the European Convention on Human Rights so we can control our borders and deport foreign criminals. We need to strip out diversity, equity, and inclusion policies from our institutions, which are doing the very opposite of what they claim to do, while mainstreaming anti-white racism among our young people. We need to remove taxpayer funding for institutions that openly push anti-British, pro-woke ideas. We need to oppose and root out all non-crime hate incidents and hate laws which are being used to control the parameters of national discussion in this country. And we need to push forward a brand of conservatism, or let's just say a brand of common sense politics, that is not afraid to intervene in the institutions to do what is ultimately required to save this country. And that will make lots of classical liberals and libertarians instinctively nervous. But having worked in the universities for 20 years, I can tell you, these institutions are not going to reform themselves. They have no incentive to reform themselves and correct a system that has become very openly rigged against the hard-working, tax-paying, law-abiding majority in this country. We can kill woke ideology in this country, but the first step to doing that means abandoning the very political parties that created, enabled, and mainstreamed woke ideology to begin with. Thank you very much. Thanks, Eric.
Thanks. Thanks a lot.
I'm going to have to dash.
So, we've heard about the situation in Britain. I'm Canadian myself, and I can only imagine, if woke isn't dead in Britain, I can't imagine it being dead in Canada, where it's running around like an uncaged zoo animal. But anyway, I will now introduce Gad Saad to come and speak about these topics. Thank you.
Can you guys flip it to the slides? Okay. So, in order to fully zombify someone so that they lose their ability to think, you have to do two things. You have to parasitize their cognitive system, which is the point of the parasitic mind, and I'll talk about what that framework is. But then the second part of the story is you also have to disable their emotional system, which is the topic of my forthcoming book, Suicidal Empathy. If I can get you to stop thinking and stop activating your emotional system properly, then I've got you completely zombified. And so I'll talk about some of these ideas. Originally, I had planned to talk about the two great wars that I have faced in my life. The first great war is the Lebanese Civil War, from which I escaped. This is where I learned what happens to a society that is perfectly organized along identity politics lines, as is the case in Rwanda and in Syria and in Iraq and in Bosnia and so on. But I don't think I have enough time. I have about 20, 25 minutes, so I'm going to skip all that stuff. The second great war, of course, is the great war on reason, on science, on logic, on common sense, on reality that I've been witnessing for now 31 years. And the reason why, in a sense, I've been writing The Parasitic Mind for 31 years now is because my scientific work seeks to incorporate evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology in studying human behavior in general and consumer behavior, economic behavior in particular. It would seem like a no-brainer that consumers are biological beings, but apparently to most of my social science colleagues, that's Nazi talk. And so that was the original time when I started here. How could these otherwise sophisticated, intelligent people be denying such obvious realities? Of course our hormones should be affecting our behaviors as economic agents. Do my cortisol levels cease to matter when I'm a consumer? Does my testosterone no longer matter when I make decisions? And so that was the original impetus of me seeing that things were wrong. And of course, it then went on overdrive since. So let me just skip a few slides. This was all related to sort of my childhood in Lebanon. But I do want to mention two ugly realities that relate to the orgiastic growth in Jew hatred, because there is sort of a running thread from many wokesters who are also quite virulently anti-Semitic. And so I'll just start with one story that originally began on our last day in Lebanon. We left Lebanon after 1 year of the Civil War. But then the second part, if you look at the tweet below it, is something that happened more recently. So the day that we left Lebanon, as we cleared the airspace of Lebanon, the captain, the pilot, declared it so. And so my mother put a Star of David around my neck and said, "Now you can wear this, be proud and not hide your identity." So hold that thought for a second. This is in 1975. About 2 weeks after October 7th, my wife with one of our children came to pick me up at a cafe where I was working on my laptop. My son had just played a soccer match in the east end of Montreal, which has a particular demographic group that is quite prevalent there. And when I got into the car, he said to me, "Daddy, if you had come to my soccer match today, and if you were wearing a Star of David, you'd be dead." So the same boy who in 1975 was able to wear a Star of David was no longer able to wear it in Montreal, Canada, 45 years later. So you may think that you can avoid the problem, but the problem will eventually find you. I thought I had it in my rearview mirror, but it's caught up to me. Let me show you the next slide. This is what you're seeing there are SWAT team police. This is not campus police. These are the official police in SWAT gear that are at my university to protect Jewish students. Now, I'd like to say Jewish professors as well, but the reality is that given my profile, I had to take a leave of absence from my university. This is why I'm now at a university in Michigan. I had to leave Concordia because it was too dangerous for me to be there. This is the reality that we're facing in the West, and yet most people, just kind of nod their head and think that the problem is elsewhere. It's going to come for everyone. So I mentioned already this, so let me now sort of talk a bit about parasitic mind. Many of you are probably familiar with my framework, but maybe not. So there are, of course, two great threats, I argue, that humanity has faced. One are actual pathogens, biological pathogens, viruses, bacteria, parasites, real parasites, fungi. But then I argue that human beings could be parasitized by a second class of parasites. I call these parasitic ideas or idea pathogens, right? And the idea, how I came up with this framework, is in reading the parasitology literature. So parasitology is the study of host-parasite interactions. So a tapeworm is a parasite, but that parasitizes your intestinal tract. But a neuroparasite is a parasite that wants to end up in the host's brain, altering its circuitry to suit typically its reproductive interest. And so examples of such parasites, if you look at the top left one, at least my left, the spider wasp will sting a much larger spider, rendering it completely zombified, but in vivo, it's live. It then pulls it into its burrow, lays eggs on it, and then as the eggs hatch, they eat the parasite in vivo. And so that is a perfect analogy for political correctness, right? That's the spider wasp's sting that zombifies you so that you walk quietly to the abyss of infinite lunacy saying, yes, yes, men too can menstruate. Yes, yes, men too can bear children. While I'm standing screaming saying, are you insane? But that's the reality. That's the spider wasp. But let's go on. Toxoplasma gondii is one that maybe some of you have heard of. It can actually infect human brains, but the typical example that people have heard of is when it infects the brain of a cat, of a mouse. Well, usually a mouse has evolved a very adaptive fear of cats, but when it is parasitized by Toxoplasma gondii, it becomes sexually attracted to the cat's urine, which is not a good mating preference to have. I'll skip the third one, but I'll talk about the next one. Some of you have heard me assign an award to wood cricket Jews. So now you will learn what that terminology comes from. So a wood cricket, as you're seeing in the bottom picture, abhors water. It wants nothing to do with water. But when it is parasitized by a hairworm, the hairworm needs it to jump into water in order to complete its reproductive cycle. So the wood cricket will jump into water, effectively committing suicide because its brain has been zombified by this hairworm to suit its interest. So now you could see how apt that parasitological framework is. So now let's look at some human forms of wood crickets. You ready? Queers for Palestine. So if you're queer, good for you, rah-rah. But if your fundamental identity that you present yourself to the world is your queer identity, then I would ask such a queer person, would it be better for you to put your support behind, say, Tel Aviv, which is one of the most queer-friendly cities in the world, short of New York, San Francisco, Montreal? Tel Aviv ranks right up there. Or would you like to put your might, your support, behind Gaza, where they have a very, very effective conversion therapy program? It's a gravity-based therapy program. So, of course, queers for Palestine. That's what a wood cricket looks like. Then we have Jewish Anna Epstein, who is so enlightened, so empathetic, so kind, so compassionate, that she was caught at Boston University pulling down the posters of babies that had been kidnapped, right? She's Jewish. Had she been at the Nova Festival, she would have met the same reality as the rest of the people there, but she transcends that. She's incredibly empathetic, not like all of you degenerates. And then the third one is a very, very empathetic Scandinavian guy from Norway. Scandinavia suffers from stage 4 suicidal empathy. And so here we've got this guy who had been sodomized by a Somali immigrant. After the Norwegian justice system had given him a very, very light sentence, because they don't believe in things like punishment. It's better to rehabilitate people because they're very kind. After he finished his sentence and he was about to be deported back to Somalia, the guy that he had sodomized, the victim, felt terrible anguish, right? Existential anguish. Because now the Somali sodomizer will not be able to maximally flourish to his full potential in Somalia instead of if he stayed in Norway. Well, as the resident evolutionary psychologist in this room, I can tell you that our emotional system did not evolve to feel great empathy for our rapists. But once you are parasitized, you do feel great empathy for your rapist. Another example of wonderful suicidal empathy and parasitic thinking, Tal Nitzan, Jewish Tal Nitzan, was a doctoral student at Hebrew University, one of the most prestigious universities in Israel, in Jerusalem. She was doing her doctoral work to try to, hopefully, and from her perspective, document the endless rapes that the IDF soldiers were committing on Palestinian women. To her utter dismay, she found out that there wasn't one documented case. Even when she is going to the sources, interviewing the Palestinian women, she couldn't identify a single verifiable documented case of such rapes. Now, of course, an honest scientist would say, oh, I guess my hypothesis was falsified. That happens in science, yes? That's why we have Popper's falsification principle, right? But in her case, she said, aha, this actually perfectly demonstrates that the IDF soldiers are truly evil, because they so dehumanize the Palestinian women that they don't even consider it worthy to rape them. So had they raped the Palestinian women, they would have been degenerate Jews. If they didn't rape the Palestinian women, they are degenerate Jews. All roads lead to bigotry. So here are some of the pathogenic, parasitic ideas that I discuss in the book. I won't go through all of them, but social constructivism, cultural relativism, many others that I could spend a whole lecture on any one of them. But I'll mention only one, the one in the center top. That's the granddaddy of all parasitic ideas. That's the one that allows all the other parasitic ideas to flourish, which is basically postmodernism. There are no objective truths other than the one objective truth that there are no objective truths. And so you might imagine how that can result in men being women. There is no, you're not shackled by your, this thing called genitalia or chromosomes or anatomical differences or morphological differences or hormonal differences or physiological differences. I can be whatever I want to be. It's my truth, not the truth. And so it is that framework that then gave opportunity for all of the other parasitic degeneracy to take place. Let me give you a few examples from Canada. If the ultimate sort of theme of today's session is woke dead, It isn't. I mean, it might slightly be in the United States because, yes, Donald Trump came in, there's a bit of an autocorrection, but it took between 50 to 80 years for each of these parasitic ideas to flourish. Every single one of them originally from the university ecosystem. And so it's going to take a lot more than just Donald Trump, reversing some of this nonsense for it to suddenly go away. So it's going to be a much longer battle. But here's an example of currently, straight off the press from Canada. University of Waterloo is sort of the Caltech or MIT of equivalent in the United States. It's a big engineering school, big computer science school. The first compiler that was designed for Fortran, one of the early computer science languages, was at the University of Waterloo. So they just advertised for 2 chaired professorships, but the highest possible chaired professorships. Those are chaired professorships that are endowed by the Canadian government. So it's extremely prestigious. I'll just read you the first one. All areas of artificial intelligence are welcome, so you could apply if you have the credentials, but not really. Because what we're really looking for, by the way, this is not my satire, which for better or worse I've become well known for. This is a straight screenshot of their actual advertisements. So the call is open only to qualified individuals, blah, blah, who self-identify as women, transgender, gender fluid, non-binary, or two-spirit. So Canada, given that it understands the value of AI and wants to be competitive, wants to ensure that its AI experts are two-spirit or whatever the other terms are, non-binary or gender fluid. That's what matters. That's what we have in Canada. But if that doesn't horrify you, this is from my own home university. The bottom figure, if you're having a hard time reading it, it's a project that seeks to decolonize light. So yes, there have been some physicists who've won Nobel Prizes working on the physics of light, but there's a problem with them. They were all white. And so because of that, you can't fully trust their epistemological viewpoint. And that's why you have to indigenize the study of light. Because the Micmac tribe will probably have a very different perspective on the physics of light. It's really important to incorporate that. But Concordia didn't stop there. In its 5-year strategic plan, the number one item, this is not satire, the number one item is to indigenize and decolonize the entire curriculum. So I could be teaching differential equations, I could be teaching prime number, pure mathematics, I could be teaching neuroscience. I need to find a way to indigenize and decolonize my program. So now you might appreciate why I took a leave of absence from Concordia University. Because I have a bit of a difficult time indigenizing evolutionary psychology. I'll skip this one, but some of you may have previously hear me talk about this. It basically refers to the fact that in 2002, I was having a conversation with a escapee from a psychiatric institute. No, sorry, I made a mistake. A graduate student in women's studies and postmodernism. And she didn't agree that only women bear children, and she didn't agree that there was a thing called the sun, where it rises in the east and sets in the west. She called it dancing hyena, to which I answered, well, the dancing hyena rises in the east and sets in the west. And she said, I don't play those label games. Ostrich parasitic syndrome is something that the UK really suffers from, and I'm here to offer you some diagnosis, I guess. So ostrich parasitic syndrome, of course, is a metaphor for the ostrich burying its head in the sand to ignore reality, which of course it doesn't actually do, but the metaphor, everybody understands it. So here what I'd like to show you is this number keeps going up. This is by the way, that number could be an underestimate. There are many different databases, fully academic databases. Many of those databases come from left-leaning groups, so you couldn't say it's the right-wing conspiracy. Since 9/11 alone, so that's 24 years, there have been 47,506 Islamic terror attacks in 70 countries. The perpetrators will tell you why they did it very clearly. They're on record. They have a video of it. But the bien-pensant is a French term sort of for the highfalutin, politically correct. The politically correct intelligentsia in the West actually knows better than the perpetrators of those attacks. So they tell us what the real reasons were. I'm going to share with you a few because it perfectly captures what ostrich parasitic syndrome is. Did you know that if a teenager is not exposed to enough art in his teenage years, that could lead to him becoming an extremist? This is why, by the way, my wife who's sitting in the audience, we make sure to take our children to museums and expose them to Chagall, Dali, and Modigliani, because otherwise they might end up going to Raqqa, Syria to join ISIS. Bill Nye explained to us, because Bill Nye wears a bow tie, and therefore he has to be saying something truthful. Bill Nye explained to us that the Bataclan attack in Paris, where I think it was 189 people were mowed down at a concert, where the perpetrators screamed some things that made it clear what the purpose was, he told us, no, it's actually quite conceivable that what drove those gentlemen to commit that act was climate change. He's not joking. He's not being satirical. He's not being hyperbolic. So when you have this kind of data in front of you and you offer explanations like not enough art exposure and not enough solar panels, then you end up with the types of problems that we see. That's why it is parasitic, right? Let's keep going. I think Matt mentioned the grooming gangs, and so a few months ago, in my, dare I say, inimitable style, I posted this exact photo, and you can look at the names of the perpetrators. They seem to have something in common, but I'm not smart enough to be able to know what that thing is. And so I put out on social media saying, hey, can I get some help from some big data thinkers that can kind of tie the running thread through this? Do you know what the real reason behind these guys is? It starts with the J. The second word is E. The third one is W. And then we close it plural, it's the Jews. So when 3 Muhammads raped your daughter, the real culprit is Mordechai. Why? Because it's the Jewish cabal that controls the immigration policy of every Western country. I didn't know that because I'm the head of the Jews and I'm never invited to those meetings. Thank you. Let me talk very briefly about what the next book is about, which has really taken off. I mean, it's unbelievable how viral it's gone. I haven't finished writing it yet. So suicidal empathy, there's been already several hit articles written on me that I am the architect behind Elon Musk, I mean, of course, the Jewish puppeteer, who is trying to create a world devoid of empathy. Okay, well, of course, that's not what I'm saying. Empathy is a perfectly explainable evolutionary-based virtue. As a social species, it makes perfect evolutionary sense that we evolve the reflex of empathy. For example, theory of mind is part of the cognitive element of empathy, right? For me to be able to have a meaningful interaction with you, I need to put myself in your mind. Autistic children fail a theory of mind test, okay? So empathy is perfectly fine, but like most things in life, it has to be regulated within certain ranges for it to be adaptive. It has to target the right people for it to be adaptive and optimal. Suicidal empathy is the dysregulation of an otherwise adaptive process. And so what I do in this book is I demonstrate that many of our insane, both domestic policies and foreign policies, are due to this dysregulated form of empathy. So fasten your seatbelt. I'm coming at you strong with that book. How to save our universities. I have a few more slides and I'll be done. How to save our universities. Now, why am I focusing on universities? Because as I said earlier, all of the woke parasitic ideas originally stem from the universities. So you first have to, rescue the universities before the downstream effect stuff starts trickling. So pursue knowledge unencumbered by ideological activism. There is no knowledge that is forbidden, right? There is no, you shouldn't do a study on race-based differences in criminality because that might marginalize the group that is shown to be more prone to criminality. The truth is the truth, whether it hurts your feelings or not. Because if that were the metric, then we should not pursue physics because, it led to the dropping of 2 atomic bombs, right? So I am in the business of pursuing truth and defending truth. The downstream effects are not for me to be concerned with. Number 2, freedom of speech, freedom of inquiry, and the pursuit of truth are deontological principles. They don't abide to a consequentialist ethics. So once you say, I believe in freedom of speech, but you are entering consequentialist world, not deontological world. Number 3, no more identity politics, promote the dignity of the individual, no more oppression Olympics, victimology, poker, and so on. No more coddling of the culture of perpetual offense and insults. A just society is rooted in the ethos of meritocracy, which of course diversity, inclusion, equity is the exact antithesis of that. The reason why I say we are not social ants is I'm referring here to a wonderful quote from E.O. Wilson, who's a famous Harvard biologist who studied social ants. And when he was asked, Professor Wilson, what are your views on communism, he said, great idea, wrong species, okay? And so social ants have evolved to be communistic. Human beings have not. We are hierarchical. Some of us are taller, shorter, harder working, less harder working, better looking, less better looking. So to try to impose equality of outcomes on a species that by inherently is hierarchical makes no sense. That's why communism has always failed. It is anti-human nature. Promote an ethos of intellectual and political diversity. Many disciplines in academia have a ratio of 130 to 0 between Democrats and Republicans. I mean, literally, 67 to 1. So the lopsidedness is not 2 to 1. It's not 5 to 1, which would be disastrous. It's in the order of you're more likely to see a unicorn on campus than a Republican professor of sociology. All ideas, beliefs, and ideologies are open to scrutiny. Okay, there is no sacred cows that we can't touch in a free society. I'll skip these. How to save the West, I'm almost done, bear with me. In order for the West to win this civilizational battle, it must proudly and unequivocally defend Western values, reject cultural relativism and the unicornia vision of multiculturalism. I do judge other cultures if they violate absolute moral truths, right? A society that doesn't tolerate child brides is superior to a society that does. A society that doesn't throw gays off the rooftops is less good than one that doesn't tolerate that. Okay, so don't be paralyzed by your fear of criticizing the other. Number 3, recommit to individual dignity over the celebration of collective identity. Recognize that all cultures are not equal. Now, we do benefit from an exchange of cultures, but not in all matters. Cultures that tolerate the Jews and don't wish to exterminate them are probably going to have greater support for individual dignity than those that wish to kill all Jews. I won't go through all of them, but you get the general idea. Now this is a beautiful, just bear with me, maybe 3 more slides. This is a beautiful quote because, well, you'll see in a second. So when I say the truth is anti-fragile, what do I mean by that? Seneca, the ancient Roman Stoic, explained to us that trees that grow in environments where they face a lot of wind stressors develop stronger roots, they develop stronger trunks. The trees that don't grow in such environments are very brittle, meaning that for many systems, including, for example, our immune system, for it to function maximally and optimally, it needs to face stressors. So for something to be truthful, it needs to be put to the test, and then if it's still standing, then it probably has some veracity. But when you say this can't be criticized, for example, Matt talked about Islamophobia. That is a perfect manifestation of something that is antithetical to nature. You want to criticize Judaism? Go at it 24 hours a day. I'm strong enough in my personhood that it's not going to bother me whether you criticize Judaism. Okay? So there is, once you say that you can't criticize this idea or this ideology, you're going down an Orwellian hellhole. The power of satire This is actually something that's very powerful because, as many of you know, one of the tools I use to try to demonstrate the lunacy is to satirize something. That's why dictators usually try to go after the ones with the sharp tongues and the spicy pen before the guys who have big muscles. The guys with the big muscles are easy to handle. The ones who have the sharp tongue, those threaten my reign, right? And so let me read you this quote, incredible quote by I think he's a German philosopher. How much truth is contained in something can be best determined by making it thoroughly laughable and then watching to see how much joking around it can take. For truth is a matter that can stand mockery, that is freshened by any ironic gesture directed at it. Whatever cannot stand satire is false. Memorize that quote. One last slide. I won't read you the entire passage, but I will explain what it means, activate your inner honey badger. Some of you have probably heard me mention this many times. It's in the last chapter of The Parasitic Mind. To activate your inner honey badger basically means, well, first of all, why am I using the honey badger? Well, the photo explains it. These big lions are actually intimidated by the honey badger that is incredibly smaller than them, and it's the size of a small to medium-sized dog. But it is so ferocious that lions will cross to the other side of the street and not mess with it. So when I say activate your inner honey badger, I'm not imploring you to be violent, physically violent. I'm imploring you to not be these cowardly, meek folks sucking your thumb in a corner in a fetal position and not ever fighting against these parasitic ideas. I'm not a tall person, but I'm the tallest person when it comes to defending the truth. Thank you very much.
Oh, well, always entertaining, a real tour de force, the way he puts complex ideas into such a digestible form and does it in such an entertaining way. I wish I had those skills. Well, last but not least, we have Batya Ungar-Sargon, who will take the floor. Thanks.
Thank you so much for having me. Man, listening to these two guys makes me really proud to be an American. I have to say, much to agree with, much to disagree with here. I'm no fan of wokeness, which I say because it might sound like I'm about to defend it, just because I heard some things that didn't quite sit right with me. I'm very focused on my country. I'm a big patriot. Probably should pay more attention to what's going on in other countries. I only found out about these grooming gangs because Elon Musk decided to tweet about it. And he tweeted about it to distract from the fact that he had majorly pissed off the MAGA base, Donald Trump's supporters, by suggesting that we're not bringing in enough H-1B visa holders to replace American workers. And this, to me, is a bit of a synecdoche for the anti-woke movement. Because the truth is, as you've just heard, some elites love wokeness, and some elites really love anti-wokeness. The elites that love wokeness love it, and I'm going to get into a deep dive into why that is, but because it gives them power. And the elites that love the anti-wokeness love it because if you are an elite and you hate wokeness, it lets you believe that you are the real victim here. It's very similar to the woke mindset. And I think in the way Matthew was talking, I shouldn't say this because he's not here to defend himself, but you could sense the thrill that a person who has a lot of power and a lot of position gets from getting to see themselves as the victim. And I think you see that in a lot of the anti-woke sentiment. And I say that I hate wokeness too. I hate it. It's bad. And listening to the chronicles of what wokeness or alleged wokeness has been able to get away with in the UK and in Canada, wow, it sounds really bad. Certainly we don't have problems like that because we have a First Amendment. But you guys have never had a First Amendment. It's not wokeness that is the reason that you don't have the same free speech rights as America. But that's how it's getting portrayed. It seems like you have a policing problem with certain populations. That's also not the result of wokeness. That's a policing problem. In fact, in America, Muslims are some of the most anti-woke people because they don't want pornography in their children's schools. And in fact, before the war in Gaza sort of exploded this, there was a really beautiful coalition forming, bringing together very religious Muslims and very religious Christians to fight the trans movement. So, it just, to me, a lot of what is getting portrayed as the result of wokeness is the result of other ways in which other countries are not as good as mine, obviously. No, I'm sorry, I couldn't resist that. But, I think that not having a First Amendment is being used to justify saying some actually hateful things. Now, I think hate speech in my country is protected speech. But to question whether citizens of your country are incompatible with the values of your country because of their faith is disgusting. That's, to me, as an American, like the whole point of the First Amendment is you can say whatever you want, but to question, I'm a religious Jew, I'm an Orthodox Jew. If somebody said, are religious Jews who are American citizens, because they're going to start outnumbering white people, like suddenly we're going to question whether Judaism is incompatible with, American values? I mean, you've all read the Bible. There's stuff in there that's certainly not consistent with the First Amendment. That's disgusting. That's a despicable thing to say. Now, I would defend all of your right to say that, but that doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it just. It doesn't make it good. It doesn't make it moral to say that just because you guys should consider having a First Amendment. Okay. Sorry, I had to get that off my chest. All right. What is wokeness? So honestly, listening to these guys talk, like wokeness in America is a bit of a joke. Like we never used it to like put people in prison or what have you. Wokeness in America, to me, is a big smokescreen for the real divide in America, which is the class divide. So how I would define wokeness is, it's when you take a worldview that should be based on right versus wrong. The Judeo-Christian Muslim worldview that says that there is virtue and there is vice. There are good things and there are bad things. And people should strive to do good and strive to be good. And strive to abhor bad. And you replace that and say the only divide that matters is who has more power and who has less power. And the more powerful is bad, and the less powerful is good. It reascribes virtue to abjection, to powerlessness, okay? And then what they did was they would take, well, how do you figure out who has more power and who has less power? Oh, the person who has, who is a racial minority has less power by definition. Ergo, they are inherently virtuous. And white people have more power, and ergo, they are inherently evil, right? Compromised morally. Or you take the gender thing, women have less power, although women have kind of been thrown out for the trans, right? So we kind of, our time, as abject and powerless is over. We're now part of like the powerful majority and thus, inherently compromise and have to cede everything to a more marginalized. So that's wokeness. It started in the university. Starts with Hegel. He had this idea of the master-slave dialectic, which Marx used to argue that between two people, there can never be real equality. There was always some exploitative relationship. And then you had the critical theorists who brought that into culture, and then in the American context, because we racialize everything, we racialized it, and you got critical race theory, then critical gender theory. It would have stayed in the university as a sort of cuckoo, cockamamie, weird way of looking at the world. Because of course we all know people who we have equal and loving relationships with. It's like obviously not true that you can't have an equal relationship with someone because they have darker skin than you. Like, it's obvious nonsense. So it would have stayed in academia where a lot of the nonsense stays, but it got mainstreamed because it was in the interests of the elites to mainstream it. It was a complete smokescreen for the ways in which liberals and the left and the Democrats were creating an economy that was an upward funnel of wealth from the working class into their own pockets. And that's why I think wokeness is really on the way out, because under Trump, what we're really seeing is sort of the revolt of the people. It's a populist revolution. It's like the twilight of the elites, and they know it. And that's what this whole Harvard thing is about, is he's waging class warfare on behalf of the forgotten working class who have seen their wages in this upward funnel, into the pockets of like Harvard graduates. And that's over now. It's like, it's very clear that moment has passed for us in the United States. But the reason that it was mainstreamed was because if you think back to the 1970s, which is was the high water mark in terms of working class purchasing power, working class power, both politically but also economically as an economic bloc. Effectively, 25% of America's economy in the 70s was in manufacturing, which is why manufacturing is so important to Trump. 60% of the wealth in our country was in the middle class, which is sort of how you build a stable democracy. You cannot have a stable democracy without a stable middle class. If you look at today, 20%, which is the largest sector of our economy, is in finance and real estate, meaning the assets that are held by the rich, and 60% of the wealth is held by the top 10%. Now, that top 10%, it used to be was Republicans, but today, over 65% of people in America who make over $500,000 a year are Democrats, and 9 of the 10 richest counties are Democrats, and 75% of hedge fund donations go to Democrats. Wall Street chose the Democrats 3 election cycles in a row over Donald Trump, who they hate because, contrary to everything you hear, the elites hate him because he's waging class warfare on them, and they know it, and the working class knows it, which is why they keep voting for him. And it was easy to miss this in 2015 because it was mostly the white working class. But over the last 3 election cycles, all but 3 majority black counties shifted to the right. 46% of Hispanics voted for Trump, and 56% of Hispanic men, 25% of black men. The working class, the multiracial working class is moving. I wouldn't say to the Republican Party, it's probably not interesting at all to you guys, the differences between the MAGA movement and the Republican Party, but that sort of started to make the edifice crumble because the Democrats had used the woke language around race to mask the ways in which they were lining their pockets, literally lining their pockets with wages that should have gone to their working class neighbors. And they did this in a bunch of ways. They did it with open border policies. So for working class people, immigration is not a cultural issue the way it is for elites. It is a very real economic issue. And it's because labor, like everything else, adheres to the ironclad law of supply and demand. The more you have of something, the cheaper it is, and the less you have of something, the dearer it is. And if you are in the elites and you have a soul, you should want the labor of your working class neighbors to pay a living wage. But instead what happened was they had this mass open border policy endorsed in my country by both sides and imported just millions and millions of people to compete with working class people in working class industries so that they could no longer afford to feed their families. They had NAFTA, which was a disastrous free trade deal, which said that, oh, you know what, we'll just move all of these great manufacturing jobs over to China to build up their middle class. And what's supposed to happen to our working class people? Well, then they defunded vocational training and said, well, they'll all go to college, which is of course ridiculous. Our economy is already overproducing college-educated people by 100%. So 50% of degree holders are underemployed. They're not even using their degree. It was just a way to make more Democrats, because of course having a degree is like the #1 predictor for being a Democrat. Of course, that also failed. So free trade immigration and defunding vocational training, the Pell Grants, the upward transfer of wealth, Harvard University getting $2 billion of taxpayer dollars a year, even though they have a $56 billion endowment. It's disgusting. But they needed an alibi, right? They were doing all of this. They were lining their pockets. Like, instead of having to pay their neighbor a living wage to watch their children, they were able to now get an illegal immigrant to do it. Instead of having to pay an American worker's value to buy a car or a washing machine, they could buy one that was produced by Uyghurs for slave labor. So what's supposed to happen to those people? Well, they developed this, they saw in the university, and this happened mostly through the media, it's what my first book is about, they saw the perfect alibi for that. Oh, well, the working class is racist. That's why they don't want an open border. We have so much. Why shouldn't we share with the rest of the world? Well, you have so much because you stole from your working class neighbor. So this is where wokeness came in. Suddenly men are upset that they can't use their physical bodies and brawn to provide for their families. Oh, didn't you know that masculinity is toxic? You're poison if you want to feed your family, right? These languages were an alibi to justify the pillaging of the working class by a newly minted upper middle class, which became the top 10%, the elites. That to me is why wokeness flourished. It is also, this is why Trump won, why he's so popular. I think if you don't live in America, the foreign policy, you see a lot of that. You see a lot of the fighting wokeness, but you don't, I think it's very hard to understand that the economic agenda, I'm gonna close that border and we're gonna put a 10% tariff on the UK and they're gonna be happy about it. And Keir Starmer's gonna call on the phone and say, please, sir, can I have some more, right? More tariffs, right? Like what that means to the struggling Rust Belt in my country, where people are committing death by suicide and fentanyl overdoses, to see a president say to Wall Street, oh yeah, I'm gonna crash your economy. I don't work for you. It's not you had your time. This stuff is so unbelievably important. I'll just give one example, which is, there was an ad that went viral that everybody thought, oh, this is why Trump won. It was because of fighting wokeness. He had an ad, and it was a video of Kamala Harris saying that she believes that taxpayer dollars should be used to fund the transgender surgeries for prison inmates, for illegal immigrants who are prisoners or in detention. And the Trump ad said, Kamala Harris is for they, them. Donald Trump is for you. It's a great ad. And everybody thought, oh, this cements it. This is why he won, because he's fighting the trans. But I think if you do a little close reading there, you'll see that the thing about that was not that people have a problem with a person deciding that they're in the wrong gender and taking their own money and changing their body. What people liked about that ad was that she was saying, no, I'm taking your money at a time when you don't have enough and you can't feed your family, and I'm taking that money and giving it to a prisoner who's jumped the line, who does not, for this frivolous thing that you don't even really believe in. That was an economic ad. And I think that that's something that gets, so here's my inner Marxist coming out, because I tend to see things through this materialist lens. But coming back to this, Elon Musk and the grooming gangs and all of that, him using that to distract from the ways in which he was trying to get Trump to undermine the American worker by advocating for more H-1B visas. I think a lot of the anti-woke language is that's what it's doing. It's a distraction from the fact that a lot of us have benefited at the expense of people who work much harder than us, and it's godless. And that, I think, is why this woke movement in America has really passed, because that moral decrepitude of the elites, not just that they believe in this worldview that allows them to justify horrible things, but like that worldview itself is used to justify the pillaging of people who work so much harder than them. Like, when you understand that, you really can see through that whole matrix. And I think that's what makes this kind of thing move on, is when we really put the needs of the people who are our neighbors, who have fewer opportunities than us, ahead of ours. Thank you.
Okay.
This is mine.
Okay, we're going to have a period of discussion here, and I think, the first thing that jumps out at me just from, what's been said, Gad and Batya, is we heard Marx mentioned and Hegel mentioned, right? So if I were to say, I'd say, Batya has the kind of neo-Marxist type argument around material conditions, and Gad has the more Hegelian argument around ideas or idea pathogens. And they're very different arguments, right, about why woke is here. One says it's kind of an elite, well, if not conspiracy, at least some kind of an intentional desire to deceive people through the use of some sort of false consciousness, as Marx would put it, where you're pulling the wool down over their eyes to distract them. God, it's much more, no, this is actually an idea pathogen that's getting in people's brains, that's being spread around like COVID, which is a much more bottom-up idea and much less of a top-down idea. And I just wonder how you two feel about that characterization. I mean, is this really a matter of a top-down economic thing, or is it a bottom-up cultural thing? Who wants to take that?
I'm not going to exactly answer it, but I'm going to say something that I hope will be interesting. I am a populist because I'm obviously very in love with my country and the people of my country and the working class of my country. I'm working on my third book, which is about Jews in my country, and obviously for me it's inseparable. There's never been a country like the United States when it comes to Jews. The American people are fundamentally philo-Semitic in nature. They're very protective of their Jewish population. They're quite pro-Israel. Although, of course, right now we're having a very legitimate question about how much we should be funding other countries. And I think, to me, there's just this inherent tolerance and for not just Jews, but the history there. I mean, it was easier to be a Jew in America than to be a Catholic for much of American history. People don't know that. A lot of the values my country was founded on was founded with the idea of Jews in mind. So the swapping out religious tolerance for religious liberty, the difference being that tolerance implies that your neighbors must tolerate you, but liberty implies that this is something God gave us, and that if you want to be right by your God, you protect the religious liberty of your neighbor. Of course, this comes back to the first comment that I made. So I think in my mind, I'll always be defending my people, the American people, and I just fundamentally don't, to me, even the anti-Semitism we're seeing right now is so limited to, people think that the college campus activism is like the tip of an iceberg, but it isn't. It's the whole iceberg right there. It is the whole damn iceberg. And so I don't really see these ideas spreading, and in fact, the opposite. I think it was working class blacks and Hispanics who really cured America of wokeness, because they were just like, this does not represent us, this is not how we talk. The Great Awakening was this moment where white progressives were more extremist in their views on race than Black Americans and Hispanic Americans. So, like, to me, all of that is evidence, like, deep in the psyche of the American people that suggests that there is this inherent resistance to bad ideas, and that they are actually the inoculation. And that's why America is healing itself, is because Trump has given them a voice. He's given the working class a voice again to voice its inherent goodness.
So I'll slightly reframe your question. So I can reframe your question as, why are these parasitic ideas so alluring? Why would someone actually believe them? And so I think I have a pretty convincing argument. So if you look at, say, cancer, there are many, many forms of cancer that behave very differently from each other. But one thing that is common to all cancers is that they involve the unchecked division of cells. So there's at least one fundamental similarity across all cancers. So what is that fundamental similarity across all of the parasitic ideas that I talk about? And so I argue in the book that each of those ideas starts off from a noble place, but then in the service of the pursuit of that noble objective, if I have to metamorphosize the idea into something that is very degenerate, so be it. So it's a consequentialist ethic. So for example, equity feminism is a great idea. It basically says that men and women should be treated equally under the law. And so probably everybody in this room would say, yeah, sign me up, I'm an equity feminist. But then radical feminists come along and say, if we are to eradicate the sexist status quo, the evil patriarchy, we need to now promulgate a message that says that there are no innate sex differences. All sex differences are socially constructed. Men and women are indistinguishable from each other. And so what started off as a good, noble idea, men and women should be equal under the law, becomes men and women are indistinguishable from each other. And I can show that each of those parasitic ideas has a similar structure. It starts off from a noble reflex, and then it metamorphosizes into bullshit.
Right. I mean, just I guess on a separate note, or I guess coming back at both of you, I mean, to try and be challenging here. So this idea of falsifiability is central to science, and so one of the questions might be, how can your theory be falsified? So if I'm talking about Batya, if we take Matt Goodwin, I think that he's really opposed to woke because he doesn't like its impact on free speech, pursuit of truth, social cohesion, and all of these other things. So I will take that view. Now, if the view is, well, or him, or perhaps some member of the Democratic Party, that, well, they don't really believe in this, but they're just doing it instrumentally for their class interest. Now, that could be the case, but how would I prove one way or another whether they genuinely believe this stuff or whether it's instrumental? So for you, and then for God, it's a similar question, right? So if, it could be that their minds have been zombified by this idea of pathogen, right? But it could also perhaps be the case that, they think this is the version of the good life. They're not completely taken over. They are perhaps subject to reasoning or persuasion. I do have my doubts with a lot of them, but I guess the question is, could your theories or could your frameworks potentially be falsified by any kind of evidence? What evidence would it take to convince you that your explanation wasn't right? Yeah.
So the issue of whether these folks truly believe the nonsense that they spread or whether in the deep recesses of their mind they don't, I actually believe both are possible. It depends on which person we're talking about. So I think, for example, the original postmodernists knew that they were willfully espousing pure bullshit. And as a matter of fact, Michel Foucault admitted to that. So in a classic conversation or in an infamous conversation with John Searle, the American philosopher, John Searle said to him, Michel, how come when I read your stuff, it seems a lot more impenetrable, but when I speak to you, you seem to make a lot more sense? And he said something to the effect of, if you need to kind of confuse people in France, otherwise they don't think that it is profound, which is literally the argument that I exactly had espoused prior to knowing of that dialogue. So imagine Jacques Derrida gets up in front of a crowd, or Jacques Lacan, or all those idiots, and they start espousing stuff in front of an audience where the audience is kind of looking at them in an admiring way. Well, that's a real grift that I can get going. I can be invited to Princeton and Cornell and say nonsense, and yet somehow it must be profound. So there is that camp. But then there is another camp that is truly parasitized. So Queers for Palestine, I mean, there's no other mechanism that you could explain that, right? But the other thing I would say, so I've had conversations with OBGYNs, obstetricians, gynecologists, who were dead set against the transphobia that I was spreading by arguing that men cannot menstruate. As a matter of fact, one OBGYN told me, I went to medical school, you didn't. Men do menstruate. So does that sound like someone who is believing her nonsense or not? Now, and those exchanges happen in a public forum. I have a pretty big platform, and so you're going to look like an idiot if you actually don't believe these things. But she was perfectly proud to say that this is insane. Of course men can menstruate. So I think it's a bit of both. Some of them don't really believe it, but stand to benefit from the signaling. Others truly have been zombified.
Right. Thanks a lot. Yeah. Batya, did you want to come in on
Well,
this?
I'm not so interested in like the motivations, but I just think it's very interesting that like people were not very worried about like free speech in England when like only extremely wealthy people had access to education, for example, or like there was no First Amendment like 30 years ago either, and it wasn't like this thing that people were, they're talking about it now because, okay, I mean, I said I'm not really interested in why, but I guess that would be how I would falsify it. I would be like, a lot of these things are constants, but they were not interested in them. Now that they are interested in them, it's a lot like the Me Too movement, which it's just undeniable that that was a jobs program for a lot of women, right? Because they would complain about their bosses and the boss would get fired and then they would have to put a woman in that job, right? Like, so you could say, well, was she really sexually harassed? Maybe. She still got the job, right? Like, it's so the material interests, right? The ways in which a class can coalesce together, I think that could be independent, I guess, of motivations. I think Matthew's great. I didn't mean to suggest that he's not. It's just that, like, the idea of, like, you know, when people make their number one political issue the fact that, you know, a tiny subset of very elite media jobs are now going to women and people of color. Okay, you know, I could see why that would bother you if you're a white man. I'm not saying that you're wrong to want the like pure meritocracy that held here, where, you know, only the sons of lords would get those jobs for 300 years or what have you. Like, but it, like, if you care about that more than like the dispossession of your neighbors, that's not something that I'm gonna think is like a higher, you know, calling or something.
Okay, and I'll probably just have one more question for discussion and before we start to move to the audience. And I'm interested, you know, Gad's from Canada, where I'm from, and I live in Britain. It's very clear also from what Matt said, the situations, certainly when it comes to wokeness, is very different, I would say, outside the US. But of course, in the US, there's a big kind of dispute between the more classical liberal people who believe in persuasion and who think, well, you know, we can reform institutions like Harvard and you know, we can win the argument, and those who say people will not change behavior until the incentives are changed. And I'm just wondering your thoughts, both of you, on whether government intervention by, let's face it, right-of-center governments, whether that's going to be necessary in order to reform institutions, and whether without government intervention and action, these institutions are just going to carry on as before, or whether, in fact, some kind of battle of ideas or persuasion, as advocated by the Greg Lukianos and Steven Pinkers and others, whether that actually can move the needle or not. Yeah, and just perhaps thinking through from the US experience, where it's clear that there, you know, you have corporate leaders, you've got some university presidents, some in elite media who seem to have changed their spots. But is that because of DeSantis and Trump and October 7th hearings where Claudine Gay was embarrassed? Or is that somehow because they genuinely had a rethink because they were persuaded by the Harper's letter or an editorial in the Washington Post against mandatory diversity statements? I mean, I'd be interested in your thoughts on where the changes come from in the US and whether raw power or ideas.
I mean, Harvard is a hedge fund with like a university attached to it, okay? So it's not doing anything out of any pure motives. I personally think the humanities are like a complete waste of time at this point, especially with AI. Like, there's no way to make sure a kid has not asked AI for an essay. They don't need that essay. They're not learning anything from forcing themselves to write it. They're so politicized. Like 95% of professors, I think, in the humanities at Harvard are liberals. It's just, I have a PhD in English from Berkeley, like I know what I'm talking about. There's nothing of value there from my point of view. I think kids are getting a lot more, like, exposed to a lot more critical thinking on TikTok than they are, like, at university. And so I just think it's lost, like, cut it off, like, stop. The only people who care about saving Harvard are the people who are, like, economically invested in maintaining their status as elites. And definitely nothing that's happening in the media or at the universities is happening out of pure motivations. It's all because of either the profit motive in media, because they're just hemorrhaging viewers and hemorrhaging credibility, because the whole Joe Biden cover-up revealed that the media's interests were completely aligned with those of the Democratic Party. So, like, it's just, that's why they're trying to do this whole, like, fake reckoning. Again, it's an alibi. They don't actually believe in any of the values that they pretend to espouse. And certainly the universities right now, you look at Columbia, I'm glad that Columbia has stopped allowing, like, rampant Jew hatred to flourish and thrive under, you know, its seal. But they are, let's, like, make no mistake about it, they're doing that because Donald Trump said, you want your $3 billion, you know, stop with the Jew hatred, which is, I think, a completely, like, legitimate use of executive power.
You know, I'm torn, because on the one hand, I am a libertarian, and I think, okay, it'd be nice for these ideas to be fleshed out in a battleground where the good ideas win, akin to a Darwinian process. But to Batya's point, oftentimes there are, through this discussion, there are violations to people's rights. So if a Harvard student can't go to class because they're too afraid to walk to campus, or they're literally blocked by a bunch of kafia guys. By the way, earlier today, my wife and I were invited, it was a wonderful honor and privilege by a Lord to the House of Lords. And as we got to the entrance of the House of Lords, there were thousands of Free Palestine, Global Intifada. Right. And so I had to go and get some police to come, because I figured I was going to be recognized, and it would be literally the worst place for me to be anywhere. Right. So in this case, I think governmental intervention makes sense. You're violating some fundamental right of the individual. I don't like when you legislate, we are now defunding gender studies, federal government. I prefer that idea dies out through a natural, organic process. So there is room for governmental interventions, and there are other places where hopefully guys like me can inoculate the world against stupidity.
Okay, all right. Well, that's an admirably libertarian approach. I think Chris Rufo would have words with you, but let's... I think it would be good just to get the audience involved for a few. I have many more questions I could ask and engage with you, but I think, do we have questions from the audience? So we've got... I got to get out of the light here because I can't see properly. We've got a question there. We'll start with Connor Tomlinson, actually.
Oh, excellent. It is working. Professor Saad, love the show, by the way. Wanted to direct this to Batya because you said...
I can't hear you well.
Pardon?
I can't hear you well.
Is the microphone... Is it okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Sorry. I wanted to direct this to Batya, if that's okay. You said it was disgusting to question whether or not a given faith was compatible with the Western values or British culture. And you said there's quite a different context in America to what it is here regarding the grooming gangs. I don't know if you know, and I'd be interested to hear your response to this, see if it changes your mind. In the UK, Pakistani men are overrepresented by a share of 4 in child sex crimes. And when the children who have been abused by these gangs come forward and speak about it, they say they've been branded with the M for Muhammad on themselves, they've been subjected to forced Quran readings, and the families of the rapists have justified the abuse of the girls because they have said they dress immodestly by Muslim standards. And when they ask the police officers, the council workers, the politicians why they didn't speak up for this, in all of the reports, they say for political correctness, for community cohesion, because they didn't want to upset the Muslim community. Now, as well as the security of Jews, which you mentioned, according to the Henry Jackson Society last year, only a quarter of British Muslims think October the 7th happened. Like 3/4 of them think Hamas did nothing wrong, and that's mainly concentrated among university-educated British-born Muslims 18 to 30. So I think we have a very different problem in the UK than we do in the US. So do you still think it's not possible to say Islam is not compatible with Britain?
Okay. Okay. I want to take questions in groups of 3 and to give them a chance to think about this.
No,
and
I want to answer that.
Oh, do you want to answer that right away?
Yeah.
Okay, fine. All right. Go.
Like, I'm sorry, those are your citizens. Citizenship is the only human right that every person has a right to. When you have citizens of your country, I'm not arguing that you don't have a cultural problem here in a certain subset of the citizenry of your country. But a country is made up of the people who live there who have that legal right. You need to work a lot harder on changing hearts and minds, because you cannot simply say that a certain citizen of your country is not compatible. And by the way, we have statistics like that in America. There are certain subpopulations who are much more overrepresented in child sex crimes. It would never occur to me to suggest that they are less citizens. Like, citizenship is a sacred thing. What are you suggesting, that they be denaturalized? Like, that is insane. That is utter. You do not have a democracy if you think you can denaturalize people based on their ideas.
Okay. All right. It's good. We're going here. We're starting to get a debate. I like this. So I'm going to take 2 questions here from the front. Go ahead, and then Alan. Go. Yeah. Great. Yeah.
Yeah, I found it very interesting what you were saying about the economic.
Can you bring closer?
Okay, about the economic side of this, because A, I'm an economist, and B, we found the same thing here during the Brexit debates, where the people who just didn't like their wages being undercut by Bulgarians and Romanians, whose wages were 2.5 times less than the UK, were all blamed for being racist and told that they were only voting Brexit because they were racist, rather than the fact that their economic circumstances were such that they hadn't had a pay rise for 20 years. So I completely understand that, but I see woke in the UK at least as slightly different, because we have a problem which is very much a sort of parasitic mind situation, where our companies now have to obey DEI rules and ESG rules. We have banks that will stop banking with people because they don't like their politics. We have all sorts of people in banks and the sort of industries the UK was famous for, and they're there because they've got purple hair and a pin through their nose and they don't know what sex they are. And, you know, that sort of thing is not why, you know, they may be really good at their job, and if they are, they're welcome to the job. But unfortunately, most of them are there not because they're good at their job. They're there because they represent some community. So I do think we've caught the virus that the mice and the cats get. You know, I do. I look at this in the city and think this is the financial capital of the universe, or it was when I got here, and they've lost it. They've completely lost it, you know.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, yeah, I go to Alan Sokal, who did the original so-called hoax paper.
Oh, I know this guy. Batya, for me, your talk was a breath of fresh air. I agree with 70% of it. So let me challenge you on the other 30%. So 2 things. I think you correctly lauded our First Amendment, and I wish in this country we had protection of freedom of speech as strongly as we do, at least under law in the United States. But isn't it true that Trump's vendetta against Harvard is clearly a violation of the First Amendment, as well as a violation of the statutes? I mean, he's cutting off $2 billion of funding without following at all the procedures that are laid down by the statute for defunding a university. So I think it's clearly a political vendetta. It's not government by law. Second thing, you pointed out, I think correctly, that wokeness was, at least in part, we can use the word scam if you want, to protect the elite economically under the guise of social justice. But then you made it sound like Trump is fighting for the working class, but isn't maybe the anti-wokeness of the Trump administration also a scam? And in fact, the working class is not going to benefit economically. I mean, so far, all Trump has done in his first term was to reduce taxes for the rich, and in the second term, to increase prices for consumers.
Thank you so much for
Okay,
those
all right.
questions.
Yeah, those are two chunky questions. We'll let you guys handle those, and then, yeah.
It's funny because Wall Street certainly was not worried that the Democrats would be better for them than Trump, right? Wall Street and the rich, the top whatever of America certainly didn't think Trump was going to be better for them, right? Kamala Harris won the majority of Americans who make over $100,000 a year, and Trump won the majority of Americans who make under $100,000 a year. Now, you may say that both the working class and the elites are totally deluded and should have reversed, but I don't tend to think about people that way. It's certainly not to the tune of 160 million people being completely wrong about which party they chose. People often say Trump's singular achievement in his first administration, in his first term, was a tax cut for the wealthy. They forget the fact that he completely sealed the border. They forget the fact that he imposed tariffs on Chinese steel and aluminum, which protected those industries in a really big way. They forget the fact that the bottom 25% saw the first wage increases they had seen in 60 years. In fact, the bottom 25% saw a 4% wage increase, and the top 25% only saw a 2.9% wage increase, which is the real reason the Democrats hate him so much, because he actually shrank the wealth gap. He did everything they pretended they were going to do, yet he did it. And yeah, consumer prices on a few things are going up. iPhones, so people who buy a new iPhone every year, people who can afford that, sorry. People who buy a new BMW every year, sorry, that's going to cost a little bit more. But the cost of the necessities that working class people were struggling to afford under the Biden administration, gas, groceries, that stuff is going down in a very radical way. And so to me, that conflation of luxury goods that are getting tariffed with we produce 75% of the food we consume. So the conflation of the luxury goods that the elites want for cheaper, which is why we had these terrible trade deals, with the necessities that working class people can't live without, which are coming down, that of course is meant to benefit the elites, Wall Street again. And what I found talking to people over the last 120 days, certainly since Liberation Day when he imposed the tariffs, is the people with the least will say to me, so you're telling me I'll pay a little bit more for something, but if I make that sacrifice, my child will have a better job in the future and be able to afford a home, and you think I'm going to say no to that bargain? That's how working class and poor people talk about the tariffs. And how you look at how Wall Street, not one of those people will ever not be rich, no matter what Trump does. And, oh no, my new iPhone is going to cost a little more every year. Again, disgusting. All right, Harvard, First Amendment. I just so don't see this as a free speech issue. This is a very liberal mindset that, we're entitled to funding, and if you take it away, you're hurting our free speech. We are NPR. We have a right to the funding, to the public taxpayer dollars, despite the fact that we're flaming leftists who hate the working class. No, you're not entitled to it. You're not entitled to anything. If you are operating in good faith in the public good, the American people, out of the goodness of their hearts, said, we're going to give you $2 billion a year. Oh, turns out you're using that money to fund the future apparatchiks of the CCP. Xi Jinping's daughter goes to Harvard. Harvard is known by the Chinese Communist Party as the party school. And you're charging my taxpayer dollars to pay for that? To me, the idea that it's a free speech issue to say no. And they gave Harvard a list of things Here's our negotiating position. We want information about any foreign student who committed a crime. Seems reasonable. We want to make sure that you're not justifying the harassment and anti-Semitism against Jewish students. Seems reasonable. We want it, a whole list of things. Some of them, I agree with you, were First Amendment I would have had problems with. But that was a starting negotiating point, and they simply refused. So sorry, we're cutting you off. No, and honestly, this is not just morally justified, I think it's legally justified, it is political genius. There's only one thing that's less popular with the American people than those Venezuelan gangbangers that they shipped back from El Salvador, and it's Harvard. And there's only one thing that's less popular than Harvard, and it's, the future apparatchiks of the Chinese Communist Party who got those spots instead of poor black kids and poor working class kids across the country. Thank you for the questions.
Gad, do you want to comment on any of those, or should we move to the next? No. Okay. By the way, I have just learned a new usage of the term party school. Okay. I went to the University of Western Ontario. It was known as a party school, but anyway. Okay. Right. We have one here, and we'll take one at the back. Go ahead. This man in the orange here.
Thank you. I've got a question about one aspect of the woke mind. I'm a lawyer, so I'm particularly interested in this. I specialize in employment law and discrimination law. This is of central interest to me. The wokerati often espouse the law and say we must uphold it. We've got to uphold the law, and I agree with that, being a lawyer. Particularly international humanitarian law, which seems a big thing. It's supreme, it's above domestic law. It's difficult then, isn't it, when they have a law which comes down from the Supreme Court. I'm talking about a ruling on the trans matter, which ruled that sex was biological rather than psychological, and they didn't like it. So what they decided to do was ignore it. And I'm thinking about some major institutions like NHS trusts and banks, private institutions like banks. They don't like it, so they're saying, we're going to carry on as we are, or, the weasel words, we're going to seek clarity on it. You've got clarity on it. It's called a Supreme Court judgment. What's your view on that? Is it just purely schizophrenia?
Okay.
I'm not sure I'm going to answer exactly what you said, because maybe I'm getting old, but I'm having a hard time hearing a lot of it. I'm having a hard time hearing what you're saying. I mean, not specifically you, everybody.
Because the microphones are pointed that way.
That's it. So, but I'm going to take a thread from your legal perspective and then link it to the first gentleman who talked about the incompatibility with certain religions with the Western tradition. I'm a scientist, so I think very analytically, okay? So, take for example Sharia law, right? In Sharia law, it says that a crime will be punished differently as a function of the identity of the perpetrator and the victim. So if a Jewish man were to kill a Muslim man, it wouldn't be the same penalty as if it were reversed. I can give you all of the sources that support that Sharia ruling.
God, I have some bad news for you about the Talmud. Sorry.
But I'll ignore that for a second. So that said, you take a fundamental principle from Lady Justice being blind, where you don't do that in American jurisprudence. Those two realities are antithetical to each other. I'm not aware of too many Talmudic extremists who are trying to...
Well, exactly. It's a political problem. It's not a religious problem. That's my point.
90% of Islam is political Islam. About 10% of it is spiritual. So political Islam is a fundamental feature of Islam. There is no Islamism or Islam. There's just Islam. Erdogan, the Turkish president, has said so. 75,000 other Islamic clerics have said exactly the same thing. So we don't have many people who are trying to infuse Talmudic principles within American jurisprudence. We are seeing in the West an incursion of Sharia principles that is incompatible. So I don't think Muslims are incompatible with the West, because I may have a lot more in common with a Muslim secularist than I might have with an Orthodox Jew. So to say Muslims are not allowed in the West, I would completely disagree with. But are there tenets of Islam, to your point, that are perfectly incompatible with the West? Nothing could be clearer. A 3-day-old pigeon understands that.
Okay. We'll go here and then there at the end. Go ahead. Yeah.
We're in England, and I'm not an Englishman. I'm here as a guest in this country, and as a part of a guest community in this country, we have to behave ourselves. If I had guests in my house, I'd expect them to behave themselves, and if they didn't, and they started doing all sorts of awful things to my sister, for example, they'd be kicked out of the house. We need to understand that citizenship is not actually that important. What's more important than citizenship is inheritance. And the English have inherited this land. This is their land. We're here not as a right, we're here at their preference. And if a community doesn't understand that, they've got no right to be here at all.
I think that's one of the saddest things I've ever heard, and I'm going to be haunted by the spectacle of you standing there and saying that. If someone in my country said that, I would ask myself what I'm doing wrong. I mean, the idea that a citizen would call themselves a guest based on their religion is horrific to me. The whole point of my country is that that is completely anathema. If somebody made a Jew feel that way in my country, I don't even know what I would do to them. I will be haunted by that for a long time.
Okay, we've got somebody over there at the far end. And wow, okay, we'll take one here.
Can you hear me?
Yep, good.
Thank you very much. Eric, I have followed your work online, and I saw one of your debates with Nathan Kaufmann on the subject of race realism. And I wonder if that is not a relevant talking point to this evening's debate, particularly with respect to its being a potential antidote to wokeness. Just to recap, race realism is this idea substantiated by academic research, much of which is currently taboo, but that there are group differences between peoples, and these group differences may go some way to explaining some of the observations that the woke advocates are making, observations which are themselves correct. For example, the differences in incarceration rates, say, in the United States. In your debate, Eric, one of the questions was about maintaining the noble lie, this idea that all groups of peoples are essentially the same, and that this noble lie is important to protect civilization, Western civilization in the world more generally, against fascism. So I'd just like to ask the question, I'd be interested to know the other panelists' view on this. To what extent is race realism a credible antidote to wokeness? And in line with some of Gad's recommendations, to what extent should we be talking about it?
Okay, this I think takes some unpacking because you may not be familiar with this debate with Nathan Kaufmann. This is this idea that there's a correlation with race and IQ, and because of persistent racial inequality and because there's no other explanation over time, the only remaining explanation has been to invent the idea of systemic racism as a sort of way of coping with this gap, and therefore we should recognize this gap, and therefore we wouldn't have wokeness. Now, I argued against that position, and mainly because I think if it were as rational as that, in the sense you would expect, for example, the first move to say, okay, we need to emphasize the black family getting back together, we need to emphasize phonics learning, we need to deal with criminality and bad behavior in class in order to get the black, at least to give culture a shot at narrowing this gap. And also I just felt it was more irrational. The nature of woke was more driven by unreason rather than actually something as well thought out as that. But it is a debate. Nathan Kaufmann, who I do respect and who is a very respected intellectual, he makes the point, he argues, and I know some other argue as well, that the non-recognition of this race realism point is really what underlies the rise of woke. Thoughts?
So I have a personal story regarding race-based differences. So arguably the most infamous psychologist to have studied this actually comes from University of Western Ontario. Do you know who it is?
I do, because I was going to University of Western Ontario when he was in that debate. Phil Rushton.
Yes, sir. So in 1996, a recently minted PhD I was back then, I was presenting at a conference, and it was very sort of vanilla stuff that I was going to do about cognitive psychology and decision making and so on. And in my session, I noticed there were maybe 1,500 people in the audience, and it was very, very electric, very, very, tense audience. And I hadn't done my homework in looking who were the other speakers in my session. I knew that they weren't there for me because I was a newly minted PhD. Nobody knew who the hell I was. And then immediately prior to my taking the podium, stands up this gentleman named Philip Rushton, who spent his entire career studying race-based differences, typically in IQ. And as he's presenting, and I'm seeing how angry the crowd is getting, I'm thinking to myself, I'm going to be lynched by proxy next. Because they're just going to lynch everybody in sight. So this was probably the only time when I felt incredibly happy, when upon him finishing his talk, out of the 1,500 that were in the audience, about 1,425 left the room to get him. And I said, thank God that there are only about 75 people to watch me. But to this general question, I've always thought, and I mentioned this in my talk today, this idea of forbidden knowledge. Philip Rushton, or anyone else, has the right to study any issue as long as he adheres fully and objectively to the scientific method. I've asked some of his colleagues whether he was inherently racist, and that's why he decided to study this. And the general story, or the unanimous feeling, was that no, he wasn't in the least bit racist, but he thought that it was an interesting question in the same way that there are many cultural and racial differences that are rooted in evolutionary processes. There is no reason to think that intelligence wouldn't be such a selected trait. And so I can't argue about what is the cause of these differences, but I wholeheartedly support that there is not a single issue that shouldn't be studied because it is too corrosive.
Interesting, and I should say that's why Nathan Kaufmann was canceled, not for advocating these views, but actually, I think, for advocating that these views should be studied. Exactly. That's all. But anyway, let's just go to some other questions. Okay, we've got one. I know I've missed one more. Okay, we've got only time for one more. I'll ask you, gentlemen in the blue shirt there. Thanks.
It's a question to Batya, and I really like a sort of a materialist approach to this stuff. There is a class war going on, and there's an entirely false economy across the Western world in academia, hugely inflated by debt and people who shouldn't be going to university. The whole net zero climate change has created an entirely artificial economy that isn't based on increasing productivity or lowering prices or producing value that other people will pay for. The huge administrative state, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a massive entrenched interest in this whole layer, this whole class of people who have built careers and their livelihoods out of this nonsense. So the first question is, how are you really going to unroot this? You really do have a class war on your hands. And you can see tactically what's happening in the States with Trump. But strategically, how are you really going to effectively replace an entire class of people that are embedded? And secondly, a new class emerging, people who do deliver value, people who work for a living, and other people pay for it. They develop products, they work, they invent things, whatever. How do you truly create conditions where that can just expand and thrive and just replace all of this crap? Because I can't see the tariffs doing that.
Well, you're wrong about the tariffs. They are extremely effective. Donald Trump has already attracted, I believe the latest number is $10 trillion in manufacturing investment. A lot of that is going to go towards things like AI warehousing, and they're going to be opening up training for working class people to train in AI so that those are working class jobs that you do not need a college degree for. The ability of a tariff to get us back to we probably won't get back to 25% being in manufacturing, but to get us back to a place where people who don't go to college can expect to have the most modest version of the American dream and raise a family in dignity and retire in dignity and have adequate health care and all the things that the elites take for granted. I think tariffs are huge. I think closing the border is a really big deal, limiting the supply of labor so that working class people can demand more. I mean, really what we're trying to do is get those working class people back into the middle class. And you're pointing out to the fact that, yeah, there's this whole like rent-seeking layer. We saw Trump fire a lot of them. About 70,000 took buyouts from various different places under the Doge. There were, thousands more who were fired. I don't advocate for anybody to be fired, but you're seeing also in corporate America, just people having had enough of the sort of DEI, the reign of terror. Obviously, I'm using that word sort of jovially, but people are sick of it. They're sick of being lectured to, I think, even, in those areas. And so those jobs are they have been already for even before Trump was elected, sort of dying a quiet death. And people are finding, new ways to be employed. The media of the last 10 years has been just in free fall. And because of that, people have been losing their jobs and finding other ways to employ themselves. I tend to see AI as an opportunity rather than something that's going to end up sort of replacing workers. There's a thing called the Javin effect, I believe it is, where when something becomes cheaper, you think there will be less of it, but actually there's an increased demand for it. So, we're not going to need to employ these thousands and thousands of programmers in Romania, but maybe there will be a higher quality of programmer who will emerge here in conversation with AI technology. We separated R&D from manufacturing. We thought we could do the research and development here and then ship the manufacturing to China. But what they basically did was they realized, the best R&D happens on the factory floor, quite near it. And so there's a lot of opportunity for innovation. The American worker is unsurpassed. And so I really think we're looking at, we had calcified into this class warfare, as you pointed out, to where you had the elites with their college degrees in the knowledge industry and then working class people who were really downwardly mobile. And I think the Trump administration, I had a meeting with the Department of Labor, and they're thinking in very creative ways about how to decalcify that and create much more movement between the classes so that there is upward mobility. And just very briefly, another thing that people like to say, oh, well, if Trump cares about workers, where's his minimum wage bill? Working class people, when you talk to them, my second book, Second Class, is I just traveled around America for a year and interviewed working class people from across the political spectrum. They were remarkably unified in the views that they had and the issues that they prioritized. They didn't want a minimum wage. They didn't see how you could sort of minimum wage your way into home ownership. What they wanted was upward mobility and opportunities. And that's really, I think, what we're seeing a lot of.
Thank you. Well, this has been a very rich conversation, and it just, I want to thank our speakers, Matt Goodwin, Batya Ungar-Sargon, and Saad. They've challenged us tonight. I like that. I like that they didn't just agree with everything. So we're going to have about a half-hour meet and greet. I think, by the way, please do, you may not have seen the little cards for my course on woke. Those of you who don't know, but there it is. Good man. But also some of us may have some books that we may be able to sign for you. I don't know about you guys, but anyway. We've got the meet and greet now. Please do stick around. And thanks to our speakers. Thank you.